Kevin Matthews, a black man enjoying a quiet afternoon in a park, becomes the target of Officer Derek Hines, who suspects him of a crime based on appearance alone. When Kevin refuses to show ID without cause, tensions rise, leading to an unjust arrest and a shocking revelation that will leave the officer stunned. It was a Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when people go out for a peaceful walk, enjoy the greenery, or maybe read a book in the park. The air was warm but pleasant, and the park was alive with people relaxing, children running around, and dogs being walked. It felt like a perfect snapshot of life in Greensboro, North Carolina. On a bench near a towering oak tree, a man named Kevin Matthews sat quietly. He had a calm demeanor, his eyes focused on the worn paperback in his hand. He wasn't dressed in anything that would stand out, just a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, the kind of attire one wears when blending into the background of a park. But Kevin wasn't just any man. He was someone who held a lot of weight in his profession, though no one would know it from his relaxed posture and quiet reading. Today, he had come to clear his head, maybe reflect on his week, and escape the constant intensity of his job. A few yards away, Officer Derek Hines was patrolling the park, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Derek had been a cop for nearly 15 years, a man who had always believed in his own gut instincts, which often told him more than any police report ever could. He'd seen things most people only ever heard about on the news. He walked past the playground, past the ice cream stand, and then his eyes landed on Kevin sitting alone, too focused on his book for Derek's comfort. There was nothing outwardly wrong, but something about the scene made Derek stop in his tracks. He stood there, watching Kevin with the intensity of someone who thought they might be seeing something more than meets the eye. Derek's mind flashed back to a recent bulletin about a suspect fitting a vague description. Tall, black male, around 40, possibly involved in a string of burglaries across the city. The bulletin was nothing more than a blip on the radar for most officers, but Derek's instinct told him to pay attention. And now, looking at Kevin, that gut feeling stirred once again. Kevin could feel the officer's gaze burning into him. He looked up from his book, locking eyes with Derek for a moment. They both knew what was happening, though neither said a word. Kevin had been in this position before, too many times to count. The assumption, the suspicion. He didn't move, didn't speak. He'd learned long ago that responding too quickly could be seen as aggression, and staying silent could be seen as defiance. It was a lose-lose scenario, but one he'd become accustomed to. Derek approached slowly, his hand resting on his belt, just close enough to his baton to send a message. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying that forced friendliness officers used when they were really asking, "What are you doing here?" Kevin nodded. "Afternoon. What brings you out here today?" Derek asked, though the question wasn't really about small talk. His eyes kept flicking to the book, to Kevin's clothes, to every minor detail as though he could pull some kind of answer out of thin air. "Just enjoying the day," Kevin replied calmly. He closed his book gently and placed it on his lap, making sure his hands were in clear view. Derek wasn't satisfied. His gut told him something was off. He'd never seen this man before, and after patrolling this park for years, Derek liked to think he knew who belonged and who didn't. He'd heard enough stories, seen enough faces to tell when something wasn't right, and this felt wrong. "You from around here?" Derek pressed. Kevin offered a polite smile. "I've been around." Derek didn't like that answer. It wasn't enough. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his stance becoming more rigid. "Mind if I see some ID?" Kevin's smile faded. He could feel the situation teetering on the edge of something bigger. He knew his rights, knew he wasn't required to provide ID for sitting in a park. But he also knew refusing would take things in a direction neither of them needed. "Am I under arrest?" Kevin asked, keeping his voice calm, unthreatening. Derek's grip tightened slightly on his belt. The man was too calm, too composed for someone who might be in trouble. It was unnerving. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Derek shot back, his voice hardening. Kevin looked around the park. People were still playing, jogging, living their lives without knowing what was unfolding just a few feet away. He sighed softly and reached for his wallet. He pulled it out slowly, carefully, and handed his ID to Derek, watching the officer's every move. Derek snatched the ID from Kevin's hand, glancing at it quickly, expecting to find something to confirm his suspicion. But there was nothing unusual about the name Kevin Matthews, nothing to suggest any kind of danger. "Stand up," Derek ordered, taking a step back to give Kevin room. Kevin didn't argue. He stood up slowly, keeping his hands in clear sight. Derek's suspicion hadn't faded. He reached for his handcuffs, his mind racing to justify the actions he was about to take. Maybe Kevin fit the description. Maybe he didn't. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. His pride had taken over, the need to assert control in a situation that felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "Turn around," Derek commanded, pulling out the cuffs. Kevin closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling a surge of frustration, but he complied. He could hear the murmurs of people around them, feel their eyes on him as Derek cuffed his wrists behind his back. Kevin's frustration ran deeper than just this one encounter. It was the weight of all the moments like this, of being reduced to a stereotype, of being seen as a potential criminal simply because of his skin color. But he remained calm, knowing any other reaction could turn this situation dangerous. As Derek led Kevin toward his patrol car, that same knot in his stomach twisted again. There was something about this arrest that didn't feel right, but he wasn't about to back down now. He had made his decision, and in his mind, there was no turning back. Kevin didn't resist, didn't say a word. His mind was already on what would come next. He wasn't worried about himself. He knew exactly who he was, and so would Derek soon enough. They reached the car, and Derek opened the back door, guiding Kevin inside. The officer glanced around nervously, feeling the eyes of the public on him, but he pressed forward. Kevin sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window as Derek got into the front, starting the engine. The drive to the precinct was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Derek felt that familiar surge of pride. He had taken control of the situation. But the nagging feeling that he had made a mistake gnawed at him. Kevin, on the other hand, was already preparing for what would happen next. This wasn't his first time dealing with a cop like Derek, and it wouldn't be the last. When they arrived at the station, Derek walked Kevin inside, his grip on Kevin's arm unnecessarily firm. As they entered, Officer Jenkins, a younger cop sitting at the front desk, looked up, surprised. "What's this about?" Jenkins asked, his eyes darting from Kevin to Derek. "Suspicious activity," Derek muttered, handing over Kevin's ID. Jenkins took it, glancing at the name before quickly looking back at Kevin. There was a brief flicker of recognition in his eyes, but he masked it quickly. "Captain Roberts is in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back. "You're gonna need to take him to her." Derek hesitated. He hadn't planned on involving the captain, but he didn't have a choice now. With a curt nod, he led Kevin down the hall. Kevin walked beside him, his expression neutral, but Derek could feel the tension building. Something was about to change, and he wasn't ready for it. Captain Roberts was sitting at her desk when Derek knocked on the door. "Come in," her voice called out, and Derek pushed the door open, guiding Kevin inside. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious," Derek said, his tone stiff. Captain Roberts looked up from her paperwork, her sharp eyes locking onto Kevin. For a split second, her expression changed. Recognition. She quickly masked it, her face returning to its usual professionalism. "I see," she said slowly, glancing down at the ID in Derek's hand. When she saw the name, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Officer Hines, step outside for a moment, please," she said, her voice firm. Derek blinked in surprise. "But Captain, now." Her tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, Derek released Kevin's arm and stepped out of the office, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door shut, Captain Roberts' expression softened. "Mr. Matthews," she said quietly, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Kevin let out a slow breath, finally allowing a small smile to creep across his face. "No need to apologize, Captain. You're just doing your job." Captain Roberts sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I'm aware of who you are, but Officer Hines doesn't. We'll handle this appropriately, but I have to ask, why didn't you just tell him who you are?" Kevin's smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because it shouldn't matter, Captain. My name, my job, none of that should be the reason I get treated with respect. It's the principle." The captain nodded, understanding. "You're right, it shouldn't matter. But unfortunately, for some people, it does." She glanced down at the file on her desk, her mind already spinning through the next steps she would need to take. "We'll take care of this. I'll call Officer Hines back in, and you'll be free to go." Kevin gave her a small nod of appreciation. He wasn't here to cause a scene or make things worse. But as Captain Roberts stood and moved to the door, Kevin couldn't help but feel a heavy weight settle on his chest. This wasn't the first time he'd been in this situation, and it wouldn't be the last. He knew there were too many people like Officer Hines, and they wouldn't all be as quick to admit their mistake. Captain Roberts opened the door, and Officer Hines stepped back into the office. His expression was wary, like he knew something was off, but couldn't quite put his finger on it. He glanced between Kevin and the captain, the tension in the room thickening. "Officer Hines," Captain Roberts began, her tone calm but commanding. "Mr. Matthews here is not the man you were looking for. You'll release him immediately." Derek blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "But Captain—" "Immediately," she repeated, her voice firm. Derek swallowed hard, realizing he was in no position to argue. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the keys to unlock Kevin's cuffs. The realization of his mistake was beginning to sink in, but his pride kept him from apologizing. As the cuffs clicked open, Kevin rubbed his wrists, giving Derek a measured look. "Thank you, officer," he said calmly, though the weight behind his words was unmistakable. Derek didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stepped back, feeling like the ground beneath him was shifting in a way he didn't quite understand. Kevin turned to Captain Roberts, offering her a nod. "I'll be in touch, Captain," he said quietly. "There's still a lot to discuss." The captain nodded, understanding the significance of his words. "I look forward to it, Mr. Matthews." With that, Kevin walked out of the office, leaving Derek standing there, feeling the full weight of what had just transpired. The confrontation was over, but Derek knew the consequences were only beginning. Back at his desk, Derek tried to focus on his paperwork, but his mind kept drifting back to what had just happened. He'd arrested an innocent man, someone who wasn't just any ordinary citizen, but a high-ranking FBI agent. He hadn't even considered the possibility that Kevin could be anything other than a suspect. His assumptions had blinded him, and now the consequences were looming over him like a storm cloud. He rubbed his temples, his thoughts spinning. He'd been a cop for over 15 years, had always trusted his instincts. But this felt different. The way Kevin had looked at him, calm and unflinching, like he had seen through Derek from the start. Derek had been the one with the badge, the authority, but Kevin had been the one in control the entire time. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite put into words. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps approaching his desk snapped Derek out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Captain Roberts walking toward him, her expression serious. "Officer Hines, my office." "Now," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Derek stood up immediately, trying to suppress the growing unease that was creeping up on him. He followed her down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they entered her office, Captain Roberts closed the door behind him and gestured for him to sit. Derek hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his back straight, trying to keep his composure. Captain Roberts moved behind her desk, her sharp eyes fixed on him. "Officer Hines, do you have any idea who Kevin Matthews is?" Derek shook his head slowly, confusion deepening. "No, Captain. Just some guy in the park." The captain leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his. "Kevin Matthews is a special agent with the FBI, not just any agent, one of their top agents." The words hit Derek like a punch to the gut. His eyes widened in shock, the full implications of what he had done crashing down on him. "An FBI agent?" he whispered, barely able to get the words out. "That's right," Captain Roberts said firmly. "And more than that, he's highly respected within the Bureau. His arrest is going to have serious consequences, not just for you, but for this entire precinct." Derek's mind raced, trying to process what this meant. He had profiled and arrested an innocent man, a federal agent, based on nothing more than his own biased assumptions. The enormity of his mistake settled in, bringing with it a cold, creeping dread. "I didn't know, Captain," Derek said, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who he was." "That's the problem, Hines," Captain Roberts replied, her voice still firm. "It shouldn't have mattered who he was. Your actions were based on assumptions and prejudices, not on any real evidence. You can't arrest someone just because they don't look like they belong in a park." Derek wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew the captain was right. He had let his biases guide his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. "What happens now?" Derek asked, his voice low, almost resigned. Captain Roberts sighed, leaning back in her chair. "For now, you're being placed on temporary leave while we investigate this incident. I've already spoken with the higher-ups and they're not happy, to say the least. There will be an official review, and depending on the outcome, you could face disciplinary action, up to and including termination." Derek's heart sank. Termination. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, and the thought of losing his job, his career, was almost too much to bear. But as much as he wanted to deny it, he knew he had no one to blame but himself. "I understand, Captain," Derek finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Captain Roberts studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Hines, but you need to understand that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you serve. We can't afford to have officers who let their biases dictate their decisions." Derek nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The reality of his situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a flood of regret. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and protected the community. But now, all of that was in jeopardy because of one careless, prejudiced decision. "You're dismissed, Officer Hines," Captain Roberts said, signaling that the conversation was over. "I'll notify you when the review is scheduled." Derek stood up, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain," he mumbled, before turning and walking out of the office. As he left the precinct, the familiar sights and sounds that had once brought him comfort now felt distant, almost alien. He walked to his car in a daze, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a heavy fog. He had been a cop for so long that he didn't know who he was without the badge. The thought of losing it, of being branded as a failure, terrified him. But beneath the fear, there was something else, an unfamiliar sense of doubt. For the first time, Derek was forced to confront the fact that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the upstanding officer he had always believed himself to be. Maybe he had let his biases and prejudices guide his actions more than he was willing to admit. As he drove home, the city streets passed by in a blur, but Derek couldn't shake the image of Kevin Matthews' calm, unflinching gaze. It was a look that had unsettled him from the start, and now he understood why. Kevin had seen right through him. He had known exactly what was happening, even before Derek himself did. When Derek finally arrived home, he sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each repetition making the weight of his actions heavier. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that his life had just changed irrevocably. With a heavy sigh, Derek got out of the car and walked into his house. The silence of the empty rooms pressed in on him, the gravity of the day finally settling in. For the first time in a long while, Derek didn't know what to do next. The next few days passed in a haze for Derek. The weight of uncertainty hung over him like a storm he couldn't escape. He was used to control, to knowing what came next, but now he felt like he was floating in limbo. The precinct had placed him on leave while the investigation ran its course, and all he could do was wait for the inevitable. The review was scheduled for Friday, just 3 days away, and Derek spent those days in restless isolation, replaying the incident in his mind over and over again. He had made a mistake, he knew that now. But what bothered him the most was how quickly it had happened. 1 second, he was in control, trusting his instincts, and the next, he was watching his career unravel because of a snap judgment. He couldn't shake the thought that maybe this wasn't just one mistake. Maybe this was something deeper, something that had been building for years. He'd always thought of himself as someone who treated everyone fairly, but the truth was starting to feel a lot messier than that. How many other times had he let his assumptions color his decisions? How many other times had he made someone feel the way he'd made Kevin Matthews feel? The questions ate at him, gnawing at the foundation of who he thought he was. When Friday arrived, Derek found himself standing outside the conference room at the precinct, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't felt this nervous in years, not since his first days as a rookie cop. The hallway was quiet, the air thick with tension. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from inside the room, Captain Roberts, the representatives from Internal Affairs, and then, unmistakably, Kevin Matthews. That was the part that stung the most. Kevin was here. Derek had hoped, maybe foolishly, that he wouldn't have to face him again. He wasn't ready to look into the eyes of the man whose life he'd disrupted. He wasn't ready for the guilt, the shame, and the realization of how deeply he'd wronged him. The door to the conference room opened, and Captain Roberts stepped out, her expression unreadable. "We're ready for you, Officer Hines," she said, her voice steady. Derek nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat, and followed her into the room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The long table was lined with stern-faced officials, and at the far end, seated calmly, was Kevin. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were focused intently on Derek. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was something even more unsettling, a calm, quiet authority. Derek took a seat across from him, trying to ignore the way his palms were sweating. The room was silent, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "Officer Hines," Captain Roberts began, her tone formal. "This review is to determine the appropriateness of your actions during the arrest of Mr. Kevin Matthews. We will go over the events leading up to the arrest, your conduct during the arrest, and the consequences that have followed. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" "Yes, Captain," Derek replied, his voice low but steady. He glanced briefly at Kevin, who was watching him with the same calm expression, before turning his focus back to the captain. "Good," she continued. "Let's start with the incident report. According to your statement, you arrested Mr. Matthews because you believed he was a suspect in a recent series of burglaries. Is that correct?" Derek nodded. "Yes, Captain. I saw him in the park, and he matched the description we had. Tall, black male, early 40s. He was acting suspiciously, so I approached him." "And what exactly was suspicious about his behavior?" Captain Roberts asked, her tone neutral but probing. Derek hesitated. He knew this was the moment that mattered most. He was sitting alone, reading a book. But when I asked for his ID, he was evasive. "Evasive how?" Captain Roberts pressed. "He didn't want to show me his ID right away," Derek explained, though even as he said the words, they sounded weak to his own ears. It seemed like he was hiding something. Kevin's voice cut through the air, calm but firm. "I was reading a book, Officer Hines. Not exactly the behavior of a criminal on the run, Derek flinched slightly at Kevin's words, but he kept his focus on Captain Roberts. "I was just doing my job, Captain. I was trying to protect the community." "And did you find anything on Mr. Matthews that would indicate he was involved in any criminal activity?" Captain Roberts asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Derek shook his head. "No, Captain. He was clean." There was a pause, a heavy silence that filled the room as everyone processed what had been said. Then one of the internal affairs officers spoke up, his voice stern. "Officer Hines, did it ever occur to you that Mr. Matthews might have been telling the truth? That he wasn't the suspect you were looking for?" Derek hesitated again, his mind racing for the right words. I was following protocol. We're trained to be cautious, to assume that someone might be dangerous until proven otherwise. But did you consider that your assumptions might have been influenced by factors other than protocol?" the officer asked pointedly. Derek's throat tightened. He knew what they were getting at, and he knew there was no good answer. "I didn't mean to profile him," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "I was just doing my job." Kevin leaned forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on Derek. "Your job is to protect and serve, Officer Hines, not to judge people based on their appearance." Derek met Kevin's eyes, and for a moment, he felt a surge of defensiveness, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when he was wrong, and this was one of those times. Captain Roberts cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to her. "Officer Hines, this review isn't just about what happened that day. It's about the mindset that led to your actions. We need to ensure that every officer in this precinct is upholding the values of fairness and justice. This isn't just about you. It's about the integrity of the entire police force." Derek felt a sinking feeling in his gut. He knew that this wasn't just about whether or not he had made a mistake. It was about whether he was fit to continue wearing the badge. The realization hit him hard, and for a moment, he struggled to find his voice. "I understand, Captain," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." He stopped, the words choking in his throat. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, the judgment hanging in the air. For the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable, exposed for who he really was. Not the cop he had always believed himself to be, but a man who had let his prejudices guide his actions. Captain Roberts softened slightly, though her tone remained firm. "We all make mistakes, Hines, but it's how we deal with those mistakes that define us. You need to think very carefully about the kind of officer you want to be." There was another long pause, the weight of the situation pressing down on everyone in the room. Then Kevin spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. "Captain Roberts, may I say something?" The captain nodded. "Of course, Mr. Matthews." Kevin stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the room. He looked directly at Derek, his expression serious, but not unkind. "I understand that being a police officer is a difficult job. You are under constant pressure, and sometimes that pressure can lead to bad decisions. But we can't allow those bad decisions to go unchecked. This isn't just about holding Officer Hines accountable, it's about ensuring that something like this doesn't happen again." Derek listened, his heart heavy. He knew Kevin was right, but the truth of it was hard to swallow. He had spent his entire career believing he was doing the right thing, but now he was faced with the reality that his actions had caused harm, that his biases had blinded him to the truth. "I'm not here to ruin anyone's career," Kevin continued, his voice steady. "But I am here to make sure that the next time an officer encounters someone like me, they think twice before making assumptions. This is an opportunity for change, and I hope that this precinct will take it seriously." Captain Roberts nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews. Your words are noted." Kevin sat down again, his gaze still on Derek. There was no malice in his eyes, but there was a firmness, a resolve that made it clear he wouldn't tolerate any further injustice. Captain Roberts looked at Derek, her tone softer, but still authoritative. "Officer Hines, you'll remain on temporary leave while we continue this review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on what's been said here today. We'll reconvene in a few days to discuss the next step." Derek nodded numbly, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Yes, Captain," he said quietly. The meeting was adjourned, and as the officials began to file out of the room, Derek remained seated, his mind racing. He had come into this review hoping to defend himself, to justify his actions, but now all he could think about was how wrong he had been. The realization was like a cold, hard truth that he couldn't escape. As the last of the officials left the room, Derek stood up slowly, his movements heavy with the burden of his thoughts. He glanced at Kevin one last time, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no animosity in Kevin's gaze, just a quiet determination, a resolve to see justice done. Derek looked away, unable to hold Kevin's gaze any longer. He knew he had a lot to think about, a lot to come to terms with, and as he walked out of the conference room, the weight of his actions and their consequences hung over him like a dark cloud. The following days passed slowly for Derek, each one filled with introspection. He had never been the kind of man to question himself. He had always trusted his instincts, his judgment. But now, for the first time, he was forced to confront the reality that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the person he thought he was. The final review meeting came sooner than he expected, and this time, there was no fanfare, no intense atmosphere. It was just him, Captain Roberts, and a representative from Internal Affairs. The decision had already been made. "Officer Hines," Captain Roberts began, her tone formal, but not without a hint of sympathy. "After reviewing the evidence and considering the statements made during the investigation, it has been decided that you will be terminated from your position as an officer of this precinct." The words hung in the air, but Derek didn't react. He had known this was coming. He had prepared himself for it, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. "You will have the opportunity to appeal the decision, but given the circumstances, it's unlikely to change," Captain Roberts added. Derek nodded, his voice barely audible as he said, "I understand, Captain." Captain Roberts paused, then added, "This doesn't have to be the end for you, Derek. You have the chance to reflect on this, to grow from it, to understand what went wrong and why." Derek didn't say anything for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. Finally, he nodded again. "I'll try." The meeting ended, and Derek walked out of the precinct for the last time. He didn't feel anger or even sadness, just a deep, overwhelming sense of loss. As he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, Derek knew that his life had changed forever. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure where he went wrong or how he would ever make it right. As Derek walked through the parking lot, each step felt heavier than the last. The precinct, once a place where he felt in control, now loomed behind him, representing not just the end of a career, but the dismantling of an identity he had held for years. Being a cop wasn't just a job, it had been his life, the thing that defined him. Now, that sense of purpose was slipping through his fingers. Derek reached his car, his hand gripping the door handle for a moment before he opened it. The door creaked as it swung open, but he didn't immediately get in. Instead, he stood there, staring at the sky. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It was strange how everything else seemed so normal, so unchanged. Yet, in Derek's world, everything was different. He finally slid into the driver's seat, the leather creaking beneath him. The silence in the car was deafening. No police radio crackling with updates, no paperwork to complete. Just him, alone with his thoughts. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. The frustration, the regret, the confusion all bubbled beneath the surface, but there was no outlet for it. What had happened? How had things gone so wrong? His mind drifted back to the beginning of his career, back when he first joined the force. He remembered the pride he felt when he put on his uniform for the first time, the sense of duty that had burned inside him. He had wanted to make a difference, to protect people, to stand up for what was right. But somewhere along the way, that had changed. The job had become routine. The people he encountered had become profiles in his mind, categories to be analyzed, judged, dealt with. He hadn't seen individuals anymore, just types. And that's what had led him to Kevin Matthews. Derek replayed the moment he first saw him in the park. At the time, he hadn't thought twice. A black man, sitting alone, quiet, too composed for Derek's comfort. He had jumped to conclusions without even realizing it. It had been second nature. But now, looking back, he could see it for what it was. A dangerous, ingrained bias that had clouded his judgment. His phone buzzed in the cup holder, snapping him out of his thoughts. Derek glanced at the screen. It was his wife, Lisa. He hadn't told her everything yet, not in detail. She knew he was on leave, but he hadn't mentioned the investigation or the fact that he was now officially without a job. He wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. He let the phone ring until it stopped, leaving a brief silence before the car filled with the soft hum of the city around him. Derek closed his eyes for a moment, leaning his head back against the seat. What would he tell her? How could he explain the shame, the guilt that was eating away at him? 20:10. He opened his eyes and looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, more worn than he had just a few days ago. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his posture more slumped. Was this who he had become? A man who let his assumptions and prejudices lead him down the wrong path? Suddenly, he felt a wave of anger wash over him, anger at himself, at the situation, at the system that had allowed him to become this way. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the sharp sound echoing through the empty car. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his voice cracking. But the anger quickly faded, replaced by a deep, hollow sense of regret. What good was anger now? It couldn't change what had happened. It couldn't undo the damage he had caused. For the first time in a long while, Derek felt truly lost. He didn't know what to do next, how to make things right. All he could do was sit there, staring out at the world around him, feeling like a stranger in his own life. Meanwhile, across town, Kevin Matthews sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea in his hands. The warm steam rose up, curling into the air, but Kevin wasn't paying attention to it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the past few days. The review, the investigation, the confrontation with Derek Hines. He had known this day would come. He had faced prejudice before, in many forms, in many places. But there was something about this incident that felt different. It wasn't just about the arrest, about being handcuffed in the park for doing nothing wrong. It was about the system that allowed officers like Derek Hines to act on their biases without questioning them. Kevin had always prided himself on staying calm, on keeping his emotions in check. He had learned long ago that reacting out of anger or frustration would only make things worse. But now, sitting here in the quiet of his home, he couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. He thought about the look on Derek's face during the review, the confusion, the guilt, the realization that he had been wrong. Kevin had seen that look before, in other officers, in other situations. But this time, he hoped it would lead to something more, something better. He took a sip of his tea, his mind drifting back to the review meeting. He had spoken his truth, laid it all out there for everyone to see. He hadn't wanted to ruin Derek's career, but he knew that accountability was necessary. People had to be held responsible for their actions, especially when those actions hurt others. Kevin set his cup down on the table, the soft clink echoing in the quiet kitchen. He stared out the window, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been judged, arrested, or mistreated because of the color of their skin. It was about making sure that the next time someone like Derek Hines made a decision, they would think twice before acting on their biases. As the light outside dimmed, Kevin felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He couldn't change the past, but he could help shape the future. He would continue to fight, continue to push for reform, for justice. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Just as Kevin was lost in thought, his phone buzzed on the table. It was an unknown number, but something told him to answer it. He picked up the phone and pressed it to his ear. "Hello?" There was a brief pause before a familiar voice came through the line. "Mr. Matthews, this is Captain Roberts." Kevin straightened in his chair, his heart rate picking up slightly. "Captain, good evening. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to give you an update on the situation with Officer Hines," she said, her voice professional, but with a hint of something softer beneath the surface. "The review board has officially terminated his employment." Kevin nodded to himself, not entirely surprised by the news. "I see. But I wanted to speak with you personally," Captain Roberts continued. "I know you've been through a lot, and I want to assure you that we are taking this seriously. We're making changes within the department. Training, accountability. Things are moving in the right direction." Kevin appreciated the sentiment, but he knew words were only the beginning. Real change took time, effort, and commitment. "I hope that's true, Captain," Kevin replied, "because it's not just about one officer. It's about the entire system." Captain Roberts was silent for a moment, and Kevin could almost hear her nodding on the other end of the line. "You're right, Mr. Matthews. We have a long way to go, but I want you to know that we're not ignoring this. Your voice has been heard." Kevin's grip tightened on the phone. "I appreciate that, Captain. But this isn't about me. It's about ensuring that the next person in my position doesn't have to go through this. It's about preventing this from happening again." Captain Roberts sighed softly. "I understand, and I'm committed to making sure we learn from this. I don't want to see this kind of thing happen again." There was a brief pause before Kevin spoke again. "Thank you for the update, Captain. I'll be watching the progress closely." With that, the conversation ended, and Kevin set the phone back on the table. He sat there for a moment, his mind processing the news. Derek Hines was no longer a police officer. It was a step in the right direction, but there was still so much more to be done. Back in Derek's world. Derek sat at his kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirled in the glass as he stared at it, lost in thought. His phone sat in front of him, the notification light blinking softly. He hadn't checked his messages in hours. What was the point? There wasn't anything anyone could say that would make this situation better. He took a slow sip, the warmth of the alcohol spreading through his chest, but it didn't take away the cold feeling that had settled deep inside him. The termination had been official for hours now. Captain Roberts had been kind, but firm. There had been no room for negotiation, no second chances. Derek knew that was the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. His mind drifted back to Kevin Matthews, the man whose life he had disrupted with one careless decision. He hadn't even known who Kevin was, but that wasn't the point. It never should have mattered who Kevin was. He was just a man sitting in a park, reading a book, and Derek had treated him like a criminal. Derek ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling up inside him again. How could he have let this happen? How could he have been so blind? The thoughts swirled in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. He had always thought of himself as a good cop, someone who did the right thing, who protected the people in his community. But now, he couldn't help but question everything. Had he really been doing his job, or had he just been operating on autopilot, letting his biases dictate his actions? Derek set the glass down on the table, leaning back in his chair. The weight of it all felt crushing, like he was drowning in his own guilt. He had spent years building a career, a reputation, and now it was all gone. And the worst part was, he knew he deserved it. He picked up his phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before finally unlocking it His inbox was filled with messages, some from colleagues, others from friends, all asking the same thing. What happened? Derek didn't have the energy to respond. He didn't want to explain it, didn't want to relive the moment when everything fell apart. Derek scrolled through the messages aimlessly, his eyes glazing over the words. None of them really mattered right now. What was he supposed to say? That he'd been fired? That he'd let his own biases destroy his career? The weight of it all pressed down harder with each second, and the more he thought about it, the heavier it became. He tossed his phone onto the table with a clatter, leaning forward and rubbing his temples. His mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying the past few days over and over again. Every decision, every word he had spoken, and every action he had taken felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. How could he have been so blind for so long? He poured another glass of whiskey, this time not even bothering to savor it. The burn in his throat was a welcome distraction from the storm raging in his head. The hours dragged on, and Derek didn't even realize how late it had gotten until he heard the front door open. Lisa had come home. He hadn't told her everything yet, and now he realized he couldn't avoid it any longer. As she entered the kitchen, her eyes immediately landed on the half-empty whiskey bottle and Derek's slouched figure. "Derek, what's going on?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. Derek didn't look up right away. He couldn't face her, not yet. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "I lost my job." There was a long, heavy pause as Lisa processed his words. "What do you mean you lost your job? What happened?" Derek finally looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. He could see the worry etched on her face, and it only made the guilt that much harder to bear. "I made a mistake," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "A big one." Lisa pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "What kind of mistake?" Derek took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He didn't know how to explain it, how to make her understand. "I arrested someone, a man named Kevin Matthews. I thought he was a suspect, but I was wrong." Lisa furrowed her brow. "But you've arrested the wrong person before. Why is this different?" Derek shook his head, feeling the weight of the truth settle even heavier on his shoulders. "It's different because I didn't just make a mistake. I profiled him. I assumed he was guilty because he was a black man sitting in the park. I didn't give him a chance. I didn't listen. I just saw what I wanted to see." Lisa's eyes widened in shock as the realization hit her. She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "Derek, are you serious?" He nodded slowly, the shame burning deep in his gut. "Yeah, I'm serious. I've been put on leave, and after the review, they terminated me. They were right to do it." Lisa sat in stunned silence for a long moment, struggling to find the right words. "Derek, I don't know what to say." "I don't either," Derek replied quietly. "I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I thought I was good at it. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now, I don't know anymore." Lisa's expression softened slightly, but there was still a tension between them. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know," Derek admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life being a cop. I don't know who I am without the badge." Lisa looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "Derek, you can't let this destroy you. You made a mistake, but that doesn't mean it's the end. You've got to figure out how to move forward." "I'm not sure how," Derek muttered, his gaze dropping back to the table. Lisa reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm. "You've always been the one to help people. Now it's time to help yourself. Learn from this. Be better." Derek squeezed her hand gently, but he couldn't shake the feeling that being better wouldn't be enough to fix the damage he had caused. How could he rebuild after this? His career was over, and his reputation was in tatters. But more than that, his faith in himself was shattered. He wasn't sure if that could ever be repaired. Lisa stood up, squeezing his shoulder gently. "I'm going to bed. Get some rest, Derek." He nodded silently, watching her leave the kitchen. The silence returned, heavier than ever. Derek knew Lisa was right. He couldn't let this destroy him. But right now, he didn't know how to keep going. The next day, Kevin Matthews was in his home office, staring at his computer screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating before he finally typed out an email to the precinct's oversight board. The message was simple, but direct. A request to follow up on the promise of reform that Captain Roberts had made. Kevin wasn't one to let things slide, especially when it came to matters of justice. He hit send and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past week still heavy on his mind. He had thought about Derek Hines a lot since the review. The man had looked like a shadow of himself during the meeting, as if the realization of what he had done had hit him all at once. Kevin had seen that look before, in others who had been forced to confront their biases head-on. It wasn't an easy thing to go through, and he didn't envy Derek for what lay ahead. But Kevin couldn't allow himself to be distracted by one man's downfall. There was still so much more work to do. The problem wasn't just Derek. It was the system that allowed people like Derek to act on their biases without consequence. Kevin knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was committed to seeing it through. His phone buzzed on the desk, and when he glanced at the screen, he saw it was an email from Captain Roberts. He opened it and read through the message quickly. The precinct was rolling out new training programs on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. It was a step in the right direction, but Kevin couldn't help but feel a twinge of skepticism. Would it be enough? Would it really make a difference? As he sat there, thinking about the road ahead, Kevin's thoughts drifted to Derek once more. He wondered what the former officer was doing right now, how he was handling the aftermath of everything that had happened. Kevin had no desire to ruin anyone's life, but he also knew that accountability was necessary for growth. After a few moments of contemplation, Kevin made a decision. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't expected to use again. The line rang a few times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Officer Hines, it's Kevin Matthews." There was a pause on the other end of the line, as if Derek was trying to process who was calling him. "Mr. Matthews?" Derek's voice sounded hesitant, uncertain. Kevin leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "I know you've been through a lot the past few days. I wanted to check in." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Derek finally spoke, his voice was strained. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I don't think this has to be the end for you," Kevin replied calmly. "What happened between us? It wasn't right. But I don't think you're beyond redemption, Derek. I think you have the opportunity to learn from this and be better." Derek's breath hitched slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with emotion. "I don't know how to be better, Kevin. I've been doing this for so long, I don't even know where to start." Kevin paused, letting the weight of Derek's words sink in. The fact that you're admitting that is a start. It's not easy to face your own mistakes, especially ones like this, but you can choose to learn from it. You can choose to do better, to be better. "I don't know how," Derek repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "None of us do at first," Kevin said gently. "But that's where growth happens, in the uncomfortable spaces, in the moments when we confront our own flaws. You've already started that process, whether you realize it or not." Derek was quiet for a long time, and Kevin could hear the tension in his breathing. "I appreciate you calling," Derek finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to be calling," Kevin admitted with a small chuckle. "But I believe in second chances, Derek. Just don't waste it." Derek let out a shaky breath. "I won't." Kevin ended the call, setting the phone back down on his desk. He stared at the screen for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a step towards something better. Derek sat in his kitchen, staring at his phone in disbelief. He hadn't expected Kevin to reach out, especially not like this. The conversation had left him feeling raw, exposed, but in a way that made him feel something he hadn't felt in days. Hope. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe there was a way forward. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild. Not his career, he knew that was over, but himself. He stood up from the table and walked over to the window, staring out at the quiet street. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. As the light faded, Derek felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what came next, and for the first time, he was ready to face it. The following weeks passed slowly for both Derek and Kevin. The investigation at the precinct had drawn to a close, but the emotional aftermath lingered. For Kevin, life had returned to some semblance of normalcy, though it was colored by a renewed sense of purpose. He kept in regular contact with Captain Roberts, monitoring the progress of the reforms that had been promised. Each update felt like a small victory, though Kevin knew there was still a long road ahead. At home, Kevin found solace in his routines: morning runs through the park, evenings spent reading, and time with his family. But beneath the surface, there was a lingering tension. He couldn't help but think about the thousands of people across the country who had experienced something similar to what he had. He was one of the lucky ones. His position, his status, had ultimately shielded him from the worst of it. But what about those who didn't have that kind of protection? It was that thought that kept him up at night. It was that thought that pushed him to continue advocating for change, even after the spotlight on his own situation had faded. Meanwhile, Derek found himself in uncharted territory. Without the routine of his job to structure his days, he felt adrift. The first few mornings after his termination were the hardest. Waking up with nowhere to go, no badge to wear, it felt like a part of him had been stripped away. He had spent 2 decades as a police officer, and now, for the first time in his adult life, he didn't know who he was without that role. He spent his days in quiet reflection, often revisiting the moments that had led to his downfall. It wasn't just about Kevin Matthews. It was about everything that had come before. All the small, seemingly insignificant decisions, the subtle biases that had shaped his worldview. He had never seen it before, but now it was all so clear, and it was painful to confront. But as the days passed, Derek began to accept the reality of his situation. He knew he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, but he also knew that wallowing in regret wouldn't change anything. Slowly, he started to piece together a plan. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was just a quiet commitment to being better, to learning from his mistakes. Derek had never been the kind of man to ask for help, but now, he realized he couldn't do this alone. He reached out to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Old friends, mentors, even some of his former colleagues. He didn't talk about the incident with Kevin at first. It was still too raw. But eventually, he found the courage to bring it up in conversations. The responses varied. Some people offered support, understanding the complexity of the situation. Others distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the idea of confronting Derek's mistakes. But there were a few people who surprised him, people who challenged him to think differently, to see the world through a new lens. It wasn't easy, but Derek was beginning to realize that growth never was. One evening, Derek found himself at a community center in his neighborhood, attending a seminar on racial bias and justice reform. He hadn't planned on going. It had been Lisa's idea. But now that he was there, he felt oddly at peace. The room was filled with people from all walks of life: teachers, social workers, activists, even a few police officers. Derek sat quietly in the back, listening as the speakers shared stories of injustice, of the ways implicit bias could shape lives, often in ways that went unnoticed. As the seminar came to a close, the speaker opened the floor for questions. Derek hesitated at first, unsure of whether he should say anything. But then, almost without thinking, he raised his hand. The speaker called on him, and Derek stood up, feeling the eyes of the room turn toward him. His heart raced as he spoke. "My name is Derek Hines," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I used to be a police officer. A few months ago, I made a mistake that cost me my career and damaged the trust of someone I should have been protecting." The room was silent as Derek continued. "I've spent the last few weeks reflecting on that mistake, trying to understand how I let my biases guide my actions. It's not easy to admit when you've been wrong, especially when your job is to uphold the law. But I'm here tonight because I want to do better. I want to learn, to be part of the solution, not the problem." There was a brief pause before the speaker responded, their voice kind but firm. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong. The fact that you're here, listening and learning, is a step in the right direction. But it's only the beginning. Real change takes time, and it requires all of us to stay committed." Derek nodded, his heart pounding. He knew this was just the start of a long journey, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. After the seminar, Derek lingered in the lobby, his mind still racing with everything he had heard. As people filtered out of the room, he found himself standing alone near the exit. He wasn't sure what he had expected from the evening, but what he felt now was different from anything he had anticipated. It wasn't closure. He knew there would never be full closure, but it was something close to it, a small glimmer of hope. As he turned to leave, he heard a voice call out his name. He stopped, turning to see a man approaching him. At first, Derek didn't recognize him, but as he got closer, the man's face came into focus. It was Kevin. "Kevin?" Derek said, his voice filled with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Kevin smiled slightly. "I've been involved in community work for a while now. This isn't my first time at one of these seminars." Derek nodded, still processing the fact that they had crossed paths again, this time in a completely different context. "You spoke well in there," Kevin said, his tone neutral. "Took a lot of guts to admit what you did." Derek swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I meant what I said. I want to do better." Kevin studied him for a moment, his eyes searching Derek's face. "I believe you." There was a long pause, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Kevin broke the silence. "You know, Derek, change doesn't happen overnight, but the fact that you're here, trying, learning, it matters. Don't lose sight of that." Derek nodded, the weight of Kevin's words settling over him. "I won't." Kevin extended his hand, and Derek shook it, feeling a sense of mutual respect pass between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step in that direction. And for now, that was enough. As Derek walked out of the community center, the cool night air hit his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he took a deep breath. There was still so much work to do, within himself, within his community, and beyond. But he was no longer running from it. He had lost his job, his identity as a cop. But what he had gained was something far more important. A sense of responsibility, not just for himself, but for the world around him. A responsibility to learn, to listen, and to grow. 3 months later. The precinct was different now. Kevin could feel it the moment he walked through the doors for a meeting with Captain Roberts. The atmosphere was quieter, more deliberate. Officers greeted him with a nod of respect, but there was something else in their demeanor, an acknowledgement of what had happened and the changes that were taking place. Captain Roberts met him in her office, her face brightened by a genuine smile. "Good to see you again, Kevin." "You too, Captain," Kevin replied as he took a seat. "I wanted to update you on the progress we've made," she began, shuffling a few papers on her desk. "The new training programs have been implemented, and we're starting to see a shift in the way our officers approach certain situations. It's not perfect yet, but we're moving in the right direction. Kevin nodded, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over him. I appreciate the effort you've put in. It's good to know that change is happening. Captain Roberts leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. And I wanted to let you know that Officer Hines has been involved in some of our outreach efforts. He's been attending community seminars, speaking about his experiences. It's been unexpected, but it seems he's committed to making amends. Kevin was quiet for a moment, digesting the news. He had wondered what Derek was doing since their last conversation. Hearing that he was actively trying to be part of the solution brought a small sense of closure. People can change, Kevin said softly. It's not always easy, but it's possible. Captain Roberts nodded in agreement. Yes, it is. The conversation shifted to other matters. Updates on the reforms, future plans for continued education within the department, but Kevin's mind kept drifting back to Derek. He had seen a man on the brink of losing everything, and somehow, Derek had chosen to face his flaws head-on. As Kevin left the precinct, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The journey wasn't over. There was still so much more to do, but for now, he could take a moment to breathe. The weight he had been carrying for so long felt a little lighter. Back at home, Kevin sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world around him was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a while, he felt at peace too. His phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced down to see a message from Derek. Thank you for giving me a chance to change. I won't waste it. Kevin smiled, typing out a quick response before setting the phone down. The road ahead was long, but now there was hope. Not just for Derek, but for everyone who was willing to confront their own biases, to learn, and to grow. Change was possible, and it had already begun.